Well, good afternoon. It's good morning in London, but I think the NUS is, I assume, in Singapore, and the respondents are in Sydney, I think. So greetings from me. My name is Ida Bernardida. I'm sitting with two other judges, Justice Ang from Singapore, I can see her there, and also Justice Derrington from Australia. We're just about to start. The clock has not yet started ticking, so the court wanted to just discuss the best way forward. We have received your outline submissions and have had a brief opportunity of looking at them. And we've also been considering the order of speakers. Our tentative view is that it would help, we think, if the respondent were prepared to address us on the question of jurisdiction, in particular with regard to the Champagne Bill. I think for a few minutes, I think we've been told possibly 4 or 5. I don't know whether that would be Mr. Turian or not. We'll hear from him in a moment, perhaps. And then we would go back then to the claimant, the first speaker, is it Mr. Wu, and then Mr. Wang, I think. And then it would then revert back to the respondents to complete their submissions on the substantive issues, with the claimants have the right of a short rebuttal in accordance with the rules. So that is what we think would be the most satisfactory way of proceeding. Let me, again, the clock is not yet ticking, but is it Mr. Turian, if I pronounce it correctly, is that acceptable to you?
Certainly, Mr. President, that's acceptable to the respondent.
Right. And to the claimants, is that acceptable to you as well?
Yes, it is acceptable.
Right, thank you. And subject to anything my co-judges may say, again, we will start in a minute. And I am not keeping timing, but as I understand it, Mr. Turian, you will be, is it 5 minutes dealing with the jurisdiction point? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. President.
And then the claimants will have the time allocated, and they will split it between them, and then it will go back to the respondent, and then the claimant will have a right of rebuttal. So I'm told that the timekeepers at the appropriate time will lift up a card in advance, so they will be dealing with that. Are there any other preliminary issues? First on the claimant side, are you content? Right, thank you.
Sorry, on the claimant side, who will deal with the jurisdiction issue?
Justice Ang, I will be dealing with the jurisdiction issue.
Sorry, could you just raise your hand? All right, and you are Mr. Wang.
Oh, I'm Mr. Wu. Yeah.
All right. Sorry. Okay, that's good because I wasn't sure.
Right, thank you. Right, Justice Derrington, is that all right?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Nothing from me.
Right, good. Thank you all very much. So the clock is going to start. 1, 2, 3. Yes, Mr. Turian.
Members of the tribunal, in March of 2021, the claimant engaged the respondent to carry and deliver 4 shipments of cargo. It is only in respect of one of these 4 shipments that the respondent raises a dispute as to this tribunal's jurisdiction to hear the claim. And the basis of this challenge lies on the express terms of that bill of lading, this being the bill of lading for the Champagne. The tribunal will find the relevant term on page 51 of the consolidated bundle, that being page 52 of the PDF.
Yes.
And if the tribunal is with me, it is clause 26 on this page. As the tribunal will see here, the tribunal that has been elected by this party to have jurisdiction is in fact the PACCC, not this tribunal, in respect of the Champagne Bill of Lading. Parties who enter into a contract are naturally presumed to have read the terms of that contract and are bound by those terms, regardless of their subjective opinions as to which terms ought to apply. There is a very strong presumption that this is the case, one which may not be easily defeated. I note that opposing counsel in point 1b of their outline of written argument, written outline of oral argument, to refer instead to a presumption that carriers will rely upon standard terms or will deal in accordance with standard terms. However, we note that it is quite clear that the objective written terms of the contract is a stronger presumption, or that they apply as a stronger presumption than that standard terms apply. But notwithstanding that, claimant seeks to argue that the parties instead intended the version 3.8 terms to apply, and that the contract with respect to the Champagne ought be amended or ought instead reflect that. However, there are 2 points that we wish to stress here. The first is that there is a very onerous burden which the claimant must overcome before it seeks to change the words of the parties' contract. Lord Denning, in the Court of Appeal in 1953, in the case of Frederick E. Rose, held that it required certainty that the parties had made a mistake and that nothing less would suffice. And further to that,
that's a very old case, isn't it? We've moved on from that, haven't we, Mr. Torian?
certainly the law has...
Are you telling me that this tribunal is bound by what Lord Denning said in 1953? It seems a very off-the-cuff kind of remark, isn't it? And here, let me tell you, the claimants say, I'm not saying it's right, but the claimants say that the change in the standard terms was expressly communicated to the claimant.
It's true, Mr. President, that that change was expressly communicated. And if I might turn to a more recent authority in the law of England, that being the decision of the Court of Wales, of the Court of Appeal of England and Wales in 2019, in the case of FSHC Group Holdings, this in a very recent survey of the doctrine of mistake and the rectification of contracts. And in particular, what was noted in that case was that common mistake requires what the court termed an outward expression of accord between the parties. So whereas it may be the case that the respondent has communicated its terms and conditions to the claimant, that clearly is insufficient to amount to an outward expression of accord naturally needing to move from both parties. There is no indication that the claimant at any point accorded to the application of the version 3.8 terms, as opposed to the version 3.7 terms, in respect of this contract. But the second point that we seek to stress is that there is no indication that the parties ever arrived at this mistaken belief in the first place. There is no reason to believe, for example, that the claimant would never see merit in applying the version 3.7 terms, given, for example, the connection between the fact that that was a shipment of champagne and involved a French shipper and its subsidiary company, and the fact that that arbitration agreement detailed the seat to be Paris and the language to be French.
But as I understand it,
sorry. Now, Mr. President, after you.
Well, a quick question, and Mr. Torian, the PACCC has not been in existence for a year or more, I think. That's right.
Yes,
and
Mr. President.
And would your client have known that or not?
Yes, it would have known that. And I note my time has expired. If I might request an extension, if it's amenable to the tribunal to continue.
Well, I interrupted you, and Justice Derrington would like to ask a question. So
my question was the same. So
right. Well, 30 seconds, Mr. Torian, to answer the tribunal's question.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's our submission that although the PACCC is no longer in existence, the remaining aspects of that version 3.7 arbitration agreement can still be given effect to. The seat of arbitration ought to be in Paris, the language ought to be French, and this tribunal cannot, as it were, magically acquire jurisdiction simply on the basis that the parties elected for a different tribunal to have jurisdiction and that that tribunal no longer exists. Accordingly, the more powerful outcome certainly, is to defer to the party's intention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turian. And now we pass over to the claimants. Is it Mr. Wu who will deal first with the jurisdiction point and then deal with the other points? Is that right? Right. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the tribunal. This present case arises out of 4 shipments on board the MV Vespucci. They involve cargoes of tulip bulbs, wines, champagnes, and pharmaceuticals. I'll be referring to the bills of lading evidencing each shipment by their cargo name. And the issues in dispute can broadly be split into 2 categories. We have the procedural issues, and this will include a challenge on jurisdiction, which the respondent has already addressed, an objection to our rights of suit, and lastly, a potential issue on the choice of law. As for the substantive issues, there are the claimant's cargo claims and the respondent's counterclaims. And I now turn to the respondent's challenge to jurisdiction. The respondents are challenging this tribunal's jurisdiction on the fact that version 3.7 has been printed on the reverse of the bills. And their argument is based on the idea that the bill of lading is the contract. However, it is tried that the bill of lading is evidence of the contract of carriage, but is not the contract of carriage. And hence, if I can show that the contract of carriage preceding the issuance of this bill of lading incorporates the version 3.8.
Mr. Wang,
yes,
what is the law of the arbitration agreement? Isn't that relevant rather than the law of the contract of carriage? Yeah,
yes.
we are referring to the tribunal's jurisdiction.
Yeah. So for the law governing the arbitration agreement, this following the 2020 UK Supreme Court case of Anchor and Chubb, now absent express choice of the law governing the arbitration agreement and absent express choice of a substantive law, then the law governing the arbitration agreement will be the law of the seat. And in this case, it will be English law. And following English law, the bill of lading is still not the contract. It is mere evidence of the contract. Okay. Thank you, Justice Ang. And hence, if I can show that the correct contract of carriage incorporates the version 3.8 terms, then the respondent's contentions cannot stand. I'll be relying on 4 key pieces of evidence to show that version 3.8 has been incorporated. Firstly, the claimant has been intimately involved in the arrangement of this carriage. Now, this contract of carriage has been done pursuant to an FOB sales agreement. And under this agreement, the shipper will have nothing or little to nothing to do with the arrangement of carriage. And hence, it is the claimant who has been the party to the original contract of carriage every step of the way. And now, what terms did the parties agree to conduct the contract of carriage on? As observed by Sir Richard Aikens in his text, The Bills of Lading, absent indications to the contrary, parties ought to be taken to have contracted on the carrier's standard terms. And in this case, the operative terms at the time of contracting were the version 3.8 terms, as the version 3.7 terms expired on the 1st January 2021. Furthermore, this change has been communicated to the claimants by the respondents. So everyone knew what were the standard terms at the time. And it's highly unlikely that there would have been an express agreement for the outdated version 3.7 terms to apply. I invite this tribunal to turn to page 104 of the record.
Sorry, the page number again?
104, Justice Ang.
Yes.
Here you'll find the closure notice for the Paris Arbitration Center for Cargo Claims. And on the right-hand side, you'll note that this center has been closed since 30th June 2020. And as the respondent counsel has conceded just now in response to Sir Bernard's question, the respondents were aware of this. And hence, it is unlikely that the
Yes,
parties,
the question is when did they become aware of this?
Yes, Justice Ang, and they would have been aware at the time of contracting as well, since the terms, their standard terms have changed some 6 months after the closure of the center, no doubt probably in response to the closure of this center.
But how is that specifically brought to their attention?
Through this notice, it states that dear value clients, due to COVID-19, we are no longer operating.
Yes, but that's not evidence that they actually saw it or read it.
Yes, Justice Errington. Well, we don't, this is as much evidence as we have on the facts. We don't have explicit evidence that the parties knew that the sender has closed. However, what this can show is that it is unlikely that parties would have expressly contracted on version 3.7 terms. Now, even if they wanted arbitration in Paris, they wouldn't have incorporated a set of terms providing for arbitration by arbitral tribunal that is closed. And hence, since parties could not have intended that version 3.7 applies, the operative standard terms, the version 3.8 terms, ought to apply. And since the bill of lading is printed with version 3.7, it is irrelevant. The bill of lading is irrelevant here, as the terms governing the contract of carriage is the version 3.8 terms. I now turn to the issue on the rights of suit. The respondents contend that the claimants have no rights of suit for pharmaceutical claims, as they are neither the shipper nor the named consignee. However, I will demonstrate that the claimants has rights of suit as the agents of the consignees in this shipment. I direct this tribunal to page 38 of the record. Here you'll find the farmer BL. At the top left-hand corner, at the second box, you'll find the named consignee, Vaxon Farmer, and below that, you'll see care of NFI.
Well, it doesn't say care of, does it? It says C / dash.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yes, Sir Banner. I take it as this is commercial writing, that it means care of. This is commercial writing meaning care of NFI, which means that it has been contractually provided that NFI is receiving the goods as agents of Vaxon Pharma at the discharge port.
Well, I'm not so sure because the address there is not the address of NFI.
Yes, Justice Ang, that would be the address of Vaxon Pharma, but that's all we can make of the C-NFI indication. And furthermore,
It doesn't mean anything.
Yes, Justice Ang, but I now direct you to page 100 of the record. And you'll see that the vessel has discharged its goods on 7th July. And this is at page 100 in the middle. You'll see that the vessel discharged on 7th July. However, Vaxon only received delivery on the 11th of July. So someone must have taken the goods at the discharge port. And this can only have been NFI, who are the freight forwarders engaged by Vaxon Pharma.
Well,
That's a very difficult inference to draw.
Yes, Justice Darrington. And if you look at the bottom of page 99, you'll see here that Vaxon has engaged NFI to arrange shipment.
yes, arranging shipment is quite different from arranging delivery, right? Acceptance of delivery.
Yes, Justice Ang, but on the facts, this is all that we have, and we argue that this suggests that NFI has taken delivery on behalf and as agents of the consignee.
But you've got a much greater difficulty, haven't you? Because if you're looking at contract, you have to ask yourself, well, when was the contract made? And this is post-contractual conduct, isn't it?
Yes, Sir Bernard, but however, in this present case, the rights of suit under Bill of Lading has transferred to the named consignee, and I'm arguing that as the agents of the named consignee,
I'm sorry, where did that come from? That the rights of suit has transferred to the consignee?
yes, and if you see here, the named consignee is Vaxon.
Which page are we looking at?
Page 38, the face of Bill of Lading itself.
Mm-hmm.
And pursuant to Section 21B of the UK Coxon 92, under this trade bill, rights of suit will have transferred to the named consignee.
But the named consignee is Vaxon Pharma, and
Yes.
the notified party is NFI.
Yes, Justice Darrington. And to answer your question, I would direct you to page 52 of the record.
Yes.
Now, in the middle of the page, you'll see that merchants includes the shipper, the consignee, and most importantly, anyone acting on behalf of such a person. And what this means is that the parties has contractually provided that the agents of the named consignee will be joined as a party to the contract. And I cite that case.
You are still making a leap that they are the agent.
Yes, Justice
That's
Jackson.
not been proved.
Yes, Justice Jackson. But our point is, if NFI is not construed as an agent in this case, then the circumstances of the case are rather hard to explain, unless we are establishing that NFI is acting as principal in the contract of carriage, in which case they'll have rights of suit nonetheless. Thank you, Justice Darrington. And here, because they are joined as a party as mentioned, the respondent has explicitly contracted that the claimants are party to the contract, and it does not lie in their mouth to assert otherwise. And I'll direct this tribunal to page 59 of the record. Here you'll see at clause 15, merchant's responsibility. 15.1, all persons coming within the definition of merchant are jointly and severally liable to the carrier for fulfillment of all obligations. Now, legal consequence of this.
Now, who's the merchant? What's the definition? Is there a definition clause?
Yes, Justice Ang, as I have pointed out previously, the definition clause is found at page 52, and merchant includes the shipper, the consignee, and anyone acting on behalf of such a person.
Yes.
Yes, sir. And hence the legal effect of this is that the claimants are personally liable for all obligations arising out of this carriage. And I cite the 2001 New South Wales Court of Appeal case of Australian Tellos. And in that case, a freight forwarder incurred personal liability for freight. This was due to a definition of merchant identical to the one that we have in the present case, and a freight clause providing that all persons falling within this definition of merchant is to be jointly and severally liable for the payment of freight. And in the present case, the claimants are not just undertaking a limited liability for freight, but for all the obligations as though they were a consignee. And to cite Blackburn J. in the Locus Classicus of Fox and Lamb, liabilities of the contract parties under contract are reciprocal. And in this case, if the claimant is liable to the respondent as though it is a consignee, then the respondent must similarly be liable to the claimant as though the claimant is a consignee. The respondent cannot have his cake and eat it, and they cannot take all the benefits of naming the agent in the contract without incurring any reciprocal liability. And hence, the claimant must have rights of suit. Now, if this tribunal is not with me on the rights of suit, then the consequence is that for this shipment, no freight will be owed, as freight will have to be claimed from the proper party. And turning to the shipment of champagne, if this tribunal finds that it has no jurisdiction for the shipment of champagne, then it similarly will have no jurisdiction to hear the claim for freight. And now turn to the last point on the choice of law. I note from the respondents' skeletal submissions that they are agreeing with us that English law ought to apply, and hence I will not be making any further submissions on this issue. However, the consequence of this is that under English law, the burden of proof under Article 3, Rule 2 of the Hague and Hague-Visby rules lies with the respondent. Following the 2018 UK Supreme Court decision in Volcafe, the claimant bears only the legal burden of proving that loss occurred during the voyage, and then the legal burden shifts to the respondent carrier to disprove negligence or to prove an accepted peril. And the significance of this is that if the evidence is unclear about whether the carrier has satisfied its duty of care, the respondents must be liable. And I have reached the end of my submissions. Unless I may be of further assistance to this tribunal, I will be passing the time on to my colleague.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Wu. And Mr. Wang?
Good evening, Mr. President, members of the tribunal. My name is Wang Shengyu, and I appear on behalf of the claimant, NFI. Today, I will prove first that the respondent is liable for all four cargo claims. Secondly, that the claimant is not liable to indemnify the respondent for its expenses incurred due to the wine leak. Since the respondents have not sought to limit their liability, I shall not venture there, except perhaps in rebuttals. Now, as English law applies, the claimant only needs to establish proof of loss. Once I have done that, the respondent bears the legal burden of either proving that it was not negligent or that it can rely on an accepted peril. Of course, I will not stop there, but also put forth a positive case proving the respondent's liability for each of its the respondent's breach of its duty to care for the cargo in each of the claims. It is crucial to note that once I have proven negligence, many of the key defenses the respondent might raise, inherent vice, insufficiency of packing, latent defects, and causes without fault or privity, cannot apply. Since this is relevant to at least two of the claims, it would be best to preface my discussion with a statement of the law on concurrent causes. Now, the explanation given by the learned authors of both Scruton and Carver is that where there are concurrent causes, the first question is whether loss can be apportioned. If it can, then it should be apportioned. But if it cannot, such as where there are two joint causes for the same damage, then the carrier must prove that the exception was the dominant cause.
You say dominant. In your submissions that we've seen at paragraph 9b, you use the word effective.
Oh, yes.
What's the difference between dominant, effective, ineffective, the effective?
Right. Apologies, Sir Bernard. I think I might have been unclear. You see what the claim, so long as the respondent's negligence was a cause of the damage and effective cause that had some causal effect, then it should be liable. It's only escape once its negligence has been an effective cause, is that it must prove that the exception was the dominant cause, the main cause of the damage. For instance, it can prove that the damage would have occurred regardless of whether or not it was negligent. But however, where there are multiple possible causes or multiple equally effective causes for the damage, the respondent cannot rely on an exception.
So what authority are you relying on for this proposition?
Well, Justice Ang, I'm glad you asked, because I actually have a long line of authorities for this. So the initial proposition comes from two House of Lords cases. Firstly, the 1929 case of Goss Millard, and secondly, the 1940 case of Smith, Hawk and Co. And both of these state that the carrier's negligence only needs to be a cause, not the cause. This rule was then applied in the High Court cases of the Torinia and the Fiona, which both stated that the carrier only escapes liability to the extent that it can prove that the loss or damage was caused by the accepted peril alone. For completeness, Australia also follows this position, as stated in the case of Gamlin Chemical. And if you're with me on this, I'll move on to my cargo claim.
So sorry, you keep referring to the negligence. Are you equating negligence with Article 3, Rule 2 of the Higgsbury Rules?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, Justice Ang. And I apologize for my lack of clarity. The reason for that is that some of these cases were decided before the Higgsbury Rules came into force. And that is why, for instance, in Smith, Hawk and Co., negligence is dealt with under the common law. However, cases such as the Torinia and the Fiona, which deal with and Gamlin Chemical, which deal with the Higgsbury Rules, apply this same causative test to Article 3, Rule 2. And that is why I use negligence interchangeably with a breach of the respondent's duties to care for the cargo.
Yeah, so whose burden, on whom is the legal burden in the context of Article 3, Rule 2?
Right. As English law applies, the respondent bears the legal burden of proving either that it was not negligent, that is, that it upheld its duty to care for the cargo, or that an accepted peril applies. In both cases, the legal burden rests on the respondent, and it must prove not only that an exception applies, but that the exception was the dominant cause, the primary or main cause of the damage.
But Mr. Wang, there's a problem, isn't there? You keep on referring to legal burden. What about the evidential burden? So is there not a distinction between the two? And the problem we have here, isn't it, that if we look, for example, at the, I think it's the Champagne, there was taping of the container vents on the Champagne. container. And therefore, in those circumstances, although the legal burden may be on the, you say, on the ship owner, here, given the circumstances that we know about, doesn't that change the position evidentially?
Well, actually, what the evidence shows is that the taping of the vents was an effective cause. It was a concurrent cause, and the evidence does not suggest which of these three contributed the most to the damage. Therefore, there is no dominant cause. And since the respondents cannot prove that the shrink wrapping or the supposedly damp pellets, which we do not admit were damp, was the dominant cause of the damage, the respondents cannot rely on such an exception, or any exception arising from these facts.
Right, thank you.
Right. Moreover, in any case, I will do my best to submit a positive case on these issues. So with that, I will begin my cargo claims. Firstly, the wines leaked during discharge because the carrier badly mishandled the container. Page 82 states in its fourth paragraph from the top or the bottom, they're the same, that 2,412.291 liters of Pinot Noir leaked from the Flat Sea. Points 1 and 2 at the top of this page show clear physical damage to the container, specifically 2 punctures on the container roof and 1 tear on the container sidewall, all consistent with impacts from container handling equipment. This despite a clean bill of lading and pre-trip inspections showing that the containers were working normally. Based on this, there was obvious mishandling of the containers, which left them badly damaged. And
so, Mr. Wang, Sea Staff and Co. was appointed by your client?
Yes, Justice Ang.
So here I see in the survey report, there's the container number.
Yes.
And they were making reference to a particular wine, type of wine, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, sorry, and then, but I see the packing list for that particular container number is Shiraz. So is that going to be a problem for you?
Well, Justice Ang, we deeply apologize for the rather shoddy work done in the typing up of the report. This was a typological error. The procedural order 2 does acknowledge their existence. So what happened here?
Sorry, say that again.
Procedural order 2,
Yes.
found on page, the relevant page, I believe, is 105.
106.
Sorry, ma'am. 106 states in the fourth paragraph from the bottom that minor typographical errors occur in any
paragraph from the bottom. Yes, all right, I see that. Yes.
Right. Minor typographical errors occur in any business context, and that for some of these, no clarification is provided. But in any case, perhaps I could clear up the issue by pointing out certain key facts. Firstly,
well, Mr. Wang, before you do that, the bill of lading for that shipment is not said to be a clean bill. Where on the bill do I find that it was clean?
It is clean for the containers because it does not state any damage to the containers.
But doesn't the bill usually say shipped in good order and condition? In apparent good order and condition? There's no such notation on this bill.
Right. Page 59 of the terms and conditions states in the first paragraph under description of goods at clause 14.1 that this bill of lading shall be prima facie evidence of the receipt by the carrier in apparent good order and condition, except that otherwise noted, of the total number of containers or other packages or units indicated in the box titled carrier's receipt on the reverse side thereof. And therefore, this contractual clause makes the bill of lading a clean one.
Thank you.
I don't understand, Mr. Wang. What does prima facie mean? Again, we're into evidence. As I understand it, tell me if it's wrong, here you used, it is said, damp pallets and shrink wrapping.
Right.
And what the respondent then says is that that's all your fault.
Right. Well, firstly, there is no evidence that the pellets were actually damp. There's really only one line suggesting this as a possible cause. It is a pure speculation by the surveyor.
But it's in your
in fact,
survey report.
Yes, and admittedly, our surveyor has not done an excellent job. However, the dampness could have occurred due to the condensation or even due to the leak champagne. Similarly, the shrink wrapping, as for the shrink wrapping, that is less defensible. However, even then, the respondent has not and cannot prove that it was the dominant cause and therefore cannot rely on this to disprove its own negligence or to prove an exception.
Sorry, why do you say that the surveyor had not done a good job? Sorry, I didn't quite follow that argument.
I mean, so apologies, Your Honor. It was just a reference to the surveyor's typological error earlier.
I think
Well, sorry, Justice Darrington.
No, I think we're probably at the same point where the implication seems to be because the report doesn't suit your client, you're asserting that it's a shoddy job.
I'm not saying that the report was a shoddy, that it does not suit my client, or that it was and I'm not saying that because it was a shoddy job. Apologies, it was a poor attempt at humor, members of the tribunal, I note my time. Perhaps I might move on.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the pharmaceuticals were damaged by freezing in transit due to a container malfunction. This resulted in the gel becoming unfit for human use. You can find this on page 100 and 101. And the surveyor ascribes this to a 58-hour temperature fluctuation, during which the container reached an ambient temperature of -24 degrees, 28 degrees lower than the correct temperature of 4 degrees. And this led to the freezing and defrosting of the product. Now, the carrier supposedly should have checked the container 4 to 5 times during this 58-hour period, and yet did not do anything about this malfunction. And this implies that it either did not carry out the checks it said it did not carry them out thoroughly, or discovered the malfunction and did nothing about it. In all cases, the carrier breached its duty to care for the cargo by not monitoring and maintaining the correct temperature.
No. How did did anybody inform the carrier of the correct temperatures?
No, Justice Ang. However, the carrier would have known the initial temperature because the containers worked correctly at the start. And when the temperature,
where does it say so?
it says in page, I believe, 100 and no, sorry, not 100. Yeah, it says in page 101 of the survey report that the fluctuation occurred between 6 and 8 April. And that indicates that the temperature was correct before that time. Now, the carrier who would have...
I don't think we can draw that inference. The only thing that the survey report suggests is we understand the containers were to be set at a temperature of +4, but that's just an understanding. Where is the evidence that the carrier knew that they were to be set at +4?
Justice Darrington, I note my time. Perhaps I could have some additional time to answer your question.
Mr. President?
Yes, certainly. One minute, Mr. Wang.
Well, Justice Darrington, I do not think it is necessary for the carrier to know the correct temperature. Once the initial temperature, the container's internal temperature, has plunged from its initial level by 28 degrees, surely they must have known that something was wrong, because the reefer container's temperature is not meant to fluctuate during the voyage. In the interest of time, perhaps I might summarize my remaining submission.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the champagnes suffered condensation damage during transit due to poor ventilation. And as the taping of the vents was a concurrent cause, the respondents are liable unless they can prove that the other factors were the dominant cause, which there is no evidence to show. Similarly, the two lips sprouted during transit due to the shipmaster's decision to wait at the Suez Canal. Now, the packing list at page 66 shows that the intended delivery date was before June 2021. So it is reasonable to infer that the tulips were shipped in the condition such that they would not have sprouted before June 2021. They only sprouted during transit because the carrier extended its voyage by 70 days.
Time up, Mr. Wang.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unless I may be of further assistance, I end my submission.
Time's up. It's a bit like Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. Right, we now turn, thank you. Who is next?
I'll be speaking for the respondent, Mr. President.
All right, Mr. Torian, and then Ms. Zhang will follow you. Is that right?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Yes, Mr. Torian.
Members of the tribunal, before turning to respond with respect to the merits of the claim, I make first one point of rebuttal concerning the claimant's submissions on jurisdiction. We note that the claimants stress that the bill of lading only constitutes evidence of the contract of carriage, and that it is trite that this is the case. However, it is also the case that in all such cases of common mistake and rectification to which I referred in my initial submissions, that was also the case, in which the parties had come to an agreement, however, had poorly reflected that agreement in a written contract. That is to say that the physical contract as the bill of lading, which the parties elected to reflect their agreement, was in fact incorrect. Accordingly, based on the authority of the Court of Appeal in 2019, to which I already referred, the claimant must still satisfy that test of the outward expression of accord and may not simply assert that the parties do in fact accord to this agreement.
But the problem here, Mr. Torian, is that the contract isn't signed by both parties. It's a bill of lading contract or document is not signed by both parties. It's only signed on behalf of one of the parties. Does that not affect the submission that you've just made?
No, Mr. President, there is no requirement that there be a signature. The requirement, and for instance, what was sufficient in the case of FSHC Group Holdings, was simply communications and emails between the parties, which evidenced or which evinced their actual intentions. Here, there exists no such communications, such as allows this tribunal to determine the parties' actual intentions.
Right, thank you.
Turning now to the merits of the claim, and it is here that we reiterate that the respondent did in fact effect delivery of all 4 shipments of cargo to Melbourne in Australia, and that it did so notwithstanding a 70-day delay in the Suez Canal, something essentially unprecedented in its history, and also notwithstanding.
Sorry, before you start, look, before we go into the facts, do you accept that Volkov is correct that the burden is on you where loss is shown to have occurred? The burden is on you to show that the loss is caused by something else. Is that right?
That is partially correct, Mr. President. However, we would note that on point in Volkov was not simply that loss had occurred in the first instance, but that the goods were shipped in apparently good order and condition, to which the onus then does shift indeed to the respondent to make out one of 2 submissions, either that it was not in breach of Article 3, Rule 2, or that it may rely on a defence under Article 4. I note that the claimant has sought to rely on representations in the bills of lading, in particular under Clause 14 of the Bill of Lading, that the goods were in fact shipped in good order and condition. But it is necessary here to turn in fact to Clause 11.1, which the tribunal will find on page 57 of the consolidated bundle. And under Clause 11.1, it is clear that no representations are made in respect of any of these cargoes, seeing as they have all been packed by the shipper. But turning first, and I make my submissions today, I should note to the tribunal with respect to 2 of the shipments of cargo, that being that of the Champagne and of the Farmers, and that my co-counsel will refer to the remaining shipments as well as the respondent's cross-claim. But turning first to the Farmers shipment, it's our primary submission here that the existence of the taped over vents does not itself indicate that the respondent was negligent. The claimant here seeks to rely on the fact that the respondent is responsible for the error, as it ought somehow to have detected or remedied the painting over of the vents. However, we simply question here how a respondent is supposed to know that a taped and painted over container was not precisely the kind of container that the shipper desired its goods to be carried in. This especially seeing as the respondent had conducted all requisite checks of the container prior to carriage. And for this, we would refer the tribunal to page 107 of the consolidated bundle. This is the procedural order to these proceedings.
Sorry, what's the page number again?
107, Madam Arbitrator.
Yes.
And notably under paragraph 10, it's clear.
Yes.
The voyage, the containers were checked is twice daily. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. President. Yes, that's correct. We note here that that is the check that was conducted. And prior to carriage, and we refer to paragraph 4 at the top of the page, that the usual pre-trip inspections were conducted. This, we submit, constitutes the duty for reasonable carriage or carriage in accordance with its duties that the respondent undertook and did so successfully. Alternatively, the respondent would rely upon a defence under the Hague-Visby rules, that being the defence under Article 4, Rule 2I, this being the defence where an act of the shipper is the proximate cause of loss. It's our submission here.
We've got another word then,
Yes.
Mr. Torian. We now have proximate. So we have effective, proximate, dominant. What's the test?
Mr. President, I apologise for the confusion to the tribunal. Proximate.
What's the proper test? What's the legal test? And where's the authority for it?
The specific term proximate was affirmed by the Court of Appeal in 2017 in the case of Volcaf, before it was reversed on other grounds by the Supreme Court in 2018, and that on reliance upon the case of Smith, Hogg, and Co. It's our submission that the...
So is it right that you are liable unless you can show, is that right? Unless you can show unless you can show that the proximate loss of the cause was due to the shipper, or what? What's the legal test?
Two alternatives. The first, that the respondent was not in fact negligent in the first place, but alternatively, that the proximate cause indeed was one of those defences under Article 4, Rule 2. The one which we seek to rely on here is the act of the shipper. And notably, it was the shipper's act here to make use of damp pallets and to make use of shrink wrapping. If I may take the tribunal to page 92 of the consolidated bundle. This is the surveyor report for the Champagne. The tribunal will see on this page, clearly in the centre, these 3 enumerated factors. Notwithstanding that there is no subordination to these factors, we submit that the proximate cause of loss can be readily identified as those first 2 causes, which were the act of the shipper, as opposed to the third. And this on the basis that the cause of loss was condensation, which the tribunal will see in the paragraph immediately above. Notably, what we submit is that the relevant moisture element clearly derived from that damp pallet, however, that the failed heat regulation, which contributed to condensation, derived both from the second and third causes, seeing as the shrink wrapping was said to retain heat. Accordingly, even had the vents been painted and taped over in a manner that was negligent, the proximate cause was still those other factors, the acts of the shipper.
So do you accept that the taping over and the painting of the vents was done by someone other than the claimant?
It must be said, Madam Arbitrator, that it is unclear which party ultimately painted and taped over the vents. They
seem to have been taped and painted over from the inside, though, because it wasn't until opening each of the containers that the vents were observed to be taped over and painted.
Certainly, we would embrace that comment, and accordingly, it seems likely that it was in fact the shipper or some party prior to that who did the taping and painting over, about which the respondent purports to have no knowledge. Turning finally to the issues of the farmers, the respondent raises a preliminary dispute here as to the claimant's title to sue. And I note that the claimant has relied here on the notation of the care of, or the C/dash notation on the bill of lading. To this, we have 2 responses. The first is that there is no indication that care of actually indicates that it will physically receive the goods at the port of discharge as it so claimed. A party into whose care goods are received could simply be a party who represents the claimant, who represents its principal in a legal manner, or the party to whom communications are sent. It implies no such physical receipt. And naturally, there can be no assumption based on the delay between the delivery at the factory and the discharge that it was in fact the claimant as opposed to any other party who affected that delivery. However, even if it is true that the claimant was acting as agent on behalf of the principal, the respondent must note that mere agency is insufficient to create title to sue. And for this, we would refer the tribunal to the decision of Montgomery, United Kingdom Mutual Steamship Association in 18...
That may be correct, but your opponents rely on the specific clause in the Bill of Lading. What do you say to that?
Mr. President, even if they do fit within that clause, merely fitting within the clause is insufficient to grant title. The submission from opposing counsel that because it fits in the clause and is liable to pay freight, it therefore derives title, is not supported by the authority upon which it sought to rely, of Australian Tower in the New South Wales Court of Appeal. That case simply affirmed the existence of such a clause as clause 15.1 and the fact that such a party is in fact liable to pay freight. And accordingly, it's our submission that whereas the respondent has effectively extended liability to pay freight to the claimant, it is not thereby enabled to derive title to sue. On that basis, there can be no award on the basis of the farmers. And on this point, I defer to my co-counsel for the remaining two goods as well as the cross-claim. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Torian. Ms. Zhang?
Members of the tribunal, you have heard from my co-counsel on the jurisdiction and the merits of the claim with respect to the champagne and farmers' shipments. I will address the issues of the tulips and the wines and make submissions on the cross-claim. Turning to my first submission, which is that respondent is not liable for the loss to the tulips. This submission has two limbs and relies on the same substantial obligations as enunciated by my co-counsel under the Hague-Bisbee rules. This means that for a respondent to succeed on this ground, the tribunal only needs to find either that respondent can show an exception under Article 4, or that respondent has not breached its obligation to properly and carefully carry the tulips pursuant to Article 3, Rule 2. First, turning to Article 4. Respondent is entitled to rely on the inherent vice exception under Article 4, Rule 2M of the Hague-Bisbee rules, and we submit that here the late stage of cultivation of the tulip bulbs constitutes such an inherent vice. An inherent vice arises if there is a characteristic which would make the tulips unfit to withstand the ordinary incidents of voyage contemplated by the contract. Here,
Didn't the ordinary incidents contemplate a contract duration of much less than 70 days?
Madam Arbitrator, we submit that the contract has not made time of the essence. And in fact, we've directed members of the tribunal to page 56 of the record, and here clause 8.1 can be found. This clause specifically provides that the carrier does not undertake that the goods will arrive at any place at any time. And clearly, time was not made of the essence. Therefore, the ordinary incidents of voyage is that to be defined in the context of this contract, whereby both parties did not expect or explicitly require that the goods had to be delivered within a specific time frame. And therefore, the argument that the ordinary incidents of voyage only constitutes a 20-day voyage would be incorrect.
But I think your co-counsel made the submission that the 70-day delay through the Suez Canal was unprecedented, not something that anyone would have contemplated. So the ordinary incidence of the voyage was 20 days, give or take 10 either side.
Madam Arbitrator, we submit that the mere nature of carriage of goods by sea is unpredictable. And therefore, even though a 70-day delay to the voyage is unprecedented, this does not necessarily mean that it was not contemplated as a possibility within the contract. And here, crucially, we submit that the late stage of cultivation of the tulips has shortened the lifespan of the tulip bulbs, and this was indeed the most important cause of damage here. We direct the tribunal members to page 73 of the record. This is the tulips survey report. and specifically to the second paragraph under the heading cause. From this paragraph, it is clear that the tulips should have survived for at least 120 days, but did not survive a 90-day voyage, despite not being exposed to excessive temperatures that would have accelerated their cultivation. This premature sprouting indicates that all three tulip varieties suffered from an advanced stage of cultivation that would enable respondent to exclude its liability on the basis of Article 4, Rule 2M. Opposing counsel has submitted that respondent cannot rely upon Article 4, Rule 2M because we cannot show that it is the proximate or dominant cause of damage to the tulips. However, we submit that the facts do in fact indicate that the proximate cause was this advanced stage of cultivation. This is because the critical factor here, as enunciated, is the shortened lifespan of the tulips. This means that regardless of whether or not the delay to this voyage had occurred, the tulips suffered from the inherent defects purely because of their shortened lifespan. This means that if the voyage had lasted more than 120 days and the tulips had sprouted, that would indicate that the delay to the voyage was a proximate cause. But here, given that the total voyage time was less than the 120 days expected for tulips to sprout, clearly the proximate cause here is the inherent vice of the tulips, the late stage of cultivation. Turning now to the issue of breach. Counsel for claimant has relied on respondent's failure to detour as the basis for its allegation that the respondent has not complied with Article 3, Rule 2. Therefore, the issue before the tribunal is whether the respondent was negligent in this failure to detour, and we submit that the respondent was not negligent for two reasons. First, detouring around the Cape of Good Hope was not a reasonable step that the respondent was required to take. What is reasonable should be assessed in light of the knowledge which the carrier had or ought to have had about the nature of the goods. We submit that although the respondent may have been aware that the tulips were prone to maturing, they did not know that the tulips were capable of suffering a form of damage through sprouting. The tulips as plant matter are distinguishable from cargoes such as fish and fruits, where delays to the voyage can lead to this cargo rotting, rendering them unfit for consumption and subsequent sale. However, the surveyor report has indicated at page 72 that the bulbs can still be cultivated and therefore retain commercial value. Furthermore, claimant may in hindsight state that a 14-day detour would be faster. However, in the minds of the Suez Canal in April 2021, when the crew approached the Suez Canal, it would have been reasonable for them to believe that it would have been more expedient for them to wait for the blockage to be resolved and to embark on a 2-week detour around the continent of Africa. This is because at the time when the crew had approached the Suez Canal, this was mere weeks after the Ever Given had blocked the canal for only 6 days. With this blockage at the forefront of the minds of the crew, it is therefore reasonable for them to expect that this blockage would be resolved in a similar period of time. And secondly, we submit that it would be unreasonable for this tribunal, with the benefit of hindsight, to impose an obligation on the carrier to take the risk and embark on the detour and to make this decision upon its approach to the Suez Canal. Again, we direct the tribunal members to page 72 of the record and the paragraph under the passage plan. The surveyors have indicated that the respondent became aware of the blockage upon approaching the Suez Canal, and after entering the Suez Canal, they remained trapped there. Therefore, we submit that the only chance available for respondent to have decided to embark on a detour was upon this approach, and we submit it is unreasonable to have required them to make this decision within that short time frame. And thus, we submit that respondent has not breached Article 3, Rule 2, and therefore is not liable for the damage to the tulips. Turning to the final issue on the merits concerning the loss of the wines. It is not disputed that the container handling equipment had punctured the external walls of the general purpose shipping container. What is in dispute here is the cause of damage to the internal flexi container, and this was the actual bag containing the wines. We submit that respondent is not liable for the loss of the wines because respondent may rely on the insufficiency of packing exception under Article 4, Rule 2N of the Hague Bisbee Rules. Counsel for claimant has submitted that the punctures to the internal flexi have arisen due to impacts from container handling equipment. However, we submit that this is an untrue inference on the facts for two reasons. First, we take the tribunal to page 82 of the record, and this is the survey report for the wines. At page 82, the third paragraph from the bottom, the surveyors have assessed the punctures to the internal flexi container. Counsel for claimant has focused on the proximity of a puncture to a tear in the external general purpose shipping container. However, what is critical in this paragraph is that both punctures identified by the surveyors are both within the vicinity of flexi fixings on the wall of the internal flexi container. And critically, there is also no puncture to the internal flexi container in the vicinity of the puncture mark to the external container that was on the roof. This means that the clear inference to be drawn is that the interior flexi container was improperly fixed by the shipper to the general purpose shipping container. And therefore, given that the shipper had failed to sufficiently pack the wines, the loss did not arise from any negligence on the part of respondent. Secondly, the surveyor reports has also stated that a large volume of wine spilled upon discharge.
Just help me to understand your submission. How does that fit in with Volcaf then, the way you put it? We know, tell me if this is wrong, we know that we're into the wines. We know that the wine suffered damage, yes?
Yes.
And therefore, the question is on the authorities then, tell me if this is wrong. It's for you to show, is it, that that the proximate cause of the damage was something for which you were not liable. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Arbitrator. We submit here that the arguments as enunciated go to establishing the exception of insufficiency of packing under Article 4, Rule 2N. And we submit that this insufficiency of packing was in fact the sole cause of loss to the wines, such that there is no need for us to establish the proximate or dominant cause. And this is because of the fact that as a large volume of wines had spilled upon discharge, it is unlikely that the spill could have originated from the pinhole punctures within the short span of time that was taken during discharge. And therefore, the more plausible explanation is that the damage to the internal flexi container had occurred earlier during packing.
And where do you get that? Where's the evidence for that?
This can be found on page 81 of the record. And
Yes.
this is the third paragraph from the bottom.
Yes. Right. I'm on page 81.
It is the third paragraph underneath the passage plan. And this is on page 81. The
Yes.
surveyor stated that a large volume of product poured from the container.
Right, but you then submitted something about likelihood, that because of that, you say, the likelihood is that what it could not have been caused by the pinholes. Is that right? Is that right?
Mr. Arbitrator, our submission is that the wines did originate from these pinhole punctures, but the dispute is when the leak began. We submit that this leak began upon the packing of the container by the shippers. And this means that when the external shipping container was punctured by the respondents upon discharge, this means that they were not in fact causing the loss of the wines, so much as exposing the existing leak that had been accruing throughout the entire journey. And on the issue of the possibility, we submit that the standard of proof here is the balance of probabilities, and that is supported by the case of Alianca.
So your submission is simply that your client accelerated the discharge of the wine.
No, Madam Arbitrator. Our submission is that the loss of the wines would have occurred regardless of whether or not the respondent had punctured the external container. This is because if the wines were already leaking from the internal flexi container, then this means that upon opening the doors of the container, the wine would have spilled out anyways. And therefore, the loss of the wine did not occur due to any fault of the respondent. Turning now to the issue of the cross.
Yes, Ms. Cheng, I just I just spotted this paragraph in the survey report. Why did your client deny access to the vessel to inspect the stow position, deck fittings, and condition of lashings?
Madam Arbitrator, which paragraph are you referring to?
Page 81, under the heading survey findings, the second paragraph.
We submit that a possible explanation for this refusal of access was because the fire brigade had already attended the scene. And therefore, this paragraph also does not show exactly who had refused access to the surveyors. Madam Arbitrator has raised that it could have been the respondent. However, we submit that it's also likely that it could have been the fire brigade who had refused access in an attempt to contain the scene for them. On that basis, we submit that this tribunal should not award claimant damages for the loss of the cargoes and should find for the respondent on the cross claim. And that concludes the submissions for the respondent.
Well, Ms. Zhang, time's up. You have had a few interruptions. Do you need 30 seconds to wrap up?
Mr. Arbitrator, we have made all of our submissions. However, if it is amenable to the tribunal, I am happy to summarize our arguments on freight in 30 seconds.
Right. I think we should, yes, let you do that. Yes, thank you, Ms. Zhang. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our argument on freight has two limbs. First, pursuant to clause 16.2, full freight has been earned upon receipt of the goods by the respondent, and this means that full freight was earned at each port of loading. And secondly, clause 16.3 provides that freight is payable on demand, and we submit that two demands have been made for freight. First, through the respective invoices of carriage, which have identified dates in March or April 2021 by which freight was payable. And second, through an email on the 2nd of September 2021 by the CEO of respondent, and therefore claimant is liable for full freight.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Zhang. And then do we go back to is it Mr. Wu or Mr. Wang?
Yes, sir, Bernard. We'll be reserving 1 minute for rebuttal each.
Right, thank you.
So I'll begin. I'll begin my rebuttals.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I have 1 point in rebuttal. The respondent has argued that my reliance on Australian tallow is flawed, and their argument is that a limited liability to pay freight does not give rise to a title to sue. However, I believe they have misconstrued my argument. My reliance on Australian tallow is to show that an agent can be brought into a party to become a party of the contract by express wording in the contract. I also agree that agent may not have a right to sue when they only have a limited liability to pay freight, like an Australian tallow. However, here the situation is different. Under clause 15, the personal liability of the claimant is all-encompassing. And as pointed out by the learned authors of Goods in Transit and Freight Forwarding, in reliance of the principle of neutrality laid out in Fox and Lamb, the corollary is that the claimants have the right to sue. And with that, I will end my rebuttals.
Thank you. Mr. Wang?
Members of the tribunal, two rebuttals for today, and I think it is most pertinent to address the two main legal questions here. Firstly, the burden of proof under Volcafe. Now, regardless of the facts, the law is that proof of loss reverses the burden of proof. We have shown proof of loss notwithstanding the lack of proof of apparent good order and condition, because the damage we have shown is consistent only with the alleged breaches of duty. Therefore, the burden of proof has been reversed and the respondents have not discharged it. Secondly, let me just explain the many terms we have used to discuss causes. And I cite Sir Richard Aikens, who states that the effective cause is merely a cause sufficiently connected to the damage to be legally causative, of which there can be multiple. Approximate or dominant cause is a single legal cause determined to the exclusion of others. In other words, it must have been able to cause the loss solely on its own. And since the respondent cannot prove that for any of the exceptions on which they rely, they are fully liable for all cargo claims. With that, I end my rebuttals.
Right, subject to my co-judges, thank you, unless they have anything to say, thank you all for your submissions. And we will deliberate. And I think if the organizers could please take us to our breakout room. We will deliberate and then come back to you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, members of the tribunal.
Thank you, members of the tribunal.
Thank you.